On Super NES Works, Castlevania goes 16-bit, but is it Sweet 16 or more of a troubled adolescence? The NES Castlevania games, despite a somewhat bumpy middle entry, stand as one of the NES's great trilogies, alongside Super Mario, Ninja Gaiden, and your pick of Mega Man games. Konami's vampire battling adventures shared a consistent worldview, visual style, mechanics, and general excellence. They feel like a cohesive unit. The unified feel of the NES games also highlighted how hard it was to create a great take on Castlevania that didn't follow directly in the footsteps of the NES original. From Vampire Killer for MSX, to Haunted Castle in arcades, to Castlevania the Adventure for Game Boy, the series' outings on other platforms tended to be not so great. It seemed that if you strayed away from the mechanics and styling of the NES games, even by going non-linear, as in the case of Castlevania II, you risked losing whatever magic made Castlevania Castlevania. But time and technology march on, and eventually the series had to move on from the NES. Sure, the Mega Man games were content to wallow in 8-bit tech for another few years after the Super NES launched, but that would never work for Castlevania. After all, the third chapter in the series was designed for an advanced chip that pushed the console well beyond its limits, and there really was nowhere for the series to go with Part 4 except to new hardware. And so Castlevania makes the leap very early to Super NES, helping to establish once and for all that this series would be an absolute mainstay of Nintendo's platform ecosystem. The name Super Castlevania IV is both exactly what it says on the box, and also a complete lie. Yes, this is Castlevania on Super NES hardware, but in many respects it's nothing like any other game in the entire franchise. It's also not really a fourth chapter in the Castlevania saga. Instead, it's another retelling of Simon Belmont's journey through the original Castlevania. I say another because that was also the focus of Vampire Killer for MSX, and for the arcade game Haunted Castle. This is the fourth take on the original Castlevania journey, which I suppose means it really is Super Castlevania IV if you look at it sideways. But this is not a by-the-numbers redux of the first game. Instead, it incorporates a lot of ideas from Castlevania III. Although its progression is strictly linear with no branching paths, and you certainly can't recruit companion characters, Super Castlevania IV charts a similar path through the Transylvanian countryside before you ultimately reach the castle itself. And as in Castlevania III, the castle itself feels like a compact rendition of the original game's gauntlet, though it certainly takes plenty of liberties. Taking liberties is the theme of Super Castlevania IV. While it retains the series' core mechanics of whipping, jumping, and utilizing sub-weapons, to its detriment at times, it puts them in service of a quirky quest that really leans into the gothic schlock spirit of the original game. The first Castlevania was a great action game, but it was also an extended riff on classic monster movies. The sequels lost sight of that feature, turning Castlevania into a legitimate saga in its own right. And far be it from me to criticize the incredible atmosphere of Dracula's curse, or the eerie descent into the castle's ruins at the end of Simon's quest, but I do love the fact that Super Castlevania IV turns up the cheese factor to 11. The game begins by playing the sound of creaky hinges and howling wolves when you make title screen selections, and it ends with silly-looking ghosts flying through the background of a treasury. Along the way, you battle familiar faces and weird new enemies that look for all the world like stop-motion figures from a Ray Harryhausen flick. You travel along swinging chandeliers as lightning flashes and thunder crashes and the fixtures groan, battle against ghostly ballroom dancers, and smash skeletons that explode into cascades of bones. Super Castlevania IV plays around with Castlevania's premise for the first time since the original game's ending credits, and it's fun. And it's not to say that the game doesn't take itself seriously at all. On the contrary, it has atmosphere like no other entry in the franchise, thanks to its methodical pace and its stunning soundtrack. Oh man, the soundtrack. Let's talk about the soundtrack. Super Castlevania IV ranks right up there with ActRaiser and Final Fantasy II as games whose composers dug right in and did their best to take advantage of the Super NES's oddball audio system. Ultimately, best comes down to a matter of personal taste in music, but Super Castlevania IV certainly justifies being designated the greatest Super NES soundtrack of 1991, or indeed one of the best of all time. By turns both moody and anxious, Super Castlevania IV's music sounds like no other video game soundtrack before it. It abandons the usual aspirations of pretending to be a hard rock and electric guitar workout or a grand symphonic work in favor of something closer in spirit to chamber music. It's smaller in scale, more intimate, with most of the sonic fullness coming from a traditional pipe organ, the kind of music a vampire would be noodling around with when you storm into his inner sanctum, your arrival fully anticipated and ready to be greeted with a pompous monologue. Oh, and speaking of noodling, the soundtrack often drifts over to jazz, with wild arpeggios and flute passages that sound like improvisation. Obviously, these are anything but improvised, having been meticulously sampled and programmed by Konami's composers, but they attempt to take game music in an organic, down-to-earth direction that goes a long way toward grounding this fantastic adventure in the real. You may be battling weird gargoyles and shattering men made of living mud, but someone's plucking pizzicato strings while you do it. The utterly unique soundscape perfectly matches the off-kilter visuals and mechanics. Konami's designers kind of fall into an obvious trap here by cranking up the visuals to full blast, and it hurts the game in a lot of ways. But it certainly makes an impression. Even disregarding the fourth stage, which consists entirely of dizzying gimmicks intended to show off funky tech tricks possible with the Super NES hardware, this is a graphical showcase. The animation is pretty limited, and there's a lot of slowdown. But look at all the details and the gloom. Super Castlevania IV ditches the gauche neon hues that were necessary with the NES's limited color palette, but you can never accuse it of looking dull or muted. Each stage has its own trademark look and theme, ranging from subterranean waterways to a haunted treasury. There's always a great musical theme to match. And above all, Super Castlevania IV's graphics are big. Like, physically enormous. Simon Belmont's sprite here stands 50% larger than his NES sprites, but the Super NES has the same effectical graphical resolution as the NES, 256 by 224 pixels. So Simon takes up a huge amount of space on screen compared to his 8-bit self, and this has a huge impact on the way Super Castlevania IV plays. Again, mostly an impact for the worse. There's no denying that this version of Simon looks pretty impressive. He has the same visual presence here as his equally large sprite in Haunted Castle, but with a better design and a much less hateful context. Indeed, where Haunted Castle is insanely unfairly difficult, Super Castlevania IV arguably errs too far in the other direction. Aside from some late-game environmental traps involving instant-kill spikes that murder Simon if he so much as brushes up against them, this whole adventure can be a real pushover. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but most of the lack of challenge comes down to how much larger here Simon is than on NES. Everything in the game world has been scaled up around him, so there's less active space around him for enemies to maneuver in. Yes, it's the infamous NES to Game Boy conundrum we've seen so many times on Game Boy Works, somehow taking form here on more powerful hardware. To their credit, Konami balanced this game around Simon's increased size, so there aren't really any unfair hazards that strike from beyond the player's visual range. The thing is though, Simon still uses his whip here as a primary form of attack, and his whip's reach has been scaled up with him. On NES, Simon in a fully extended whip spanned roughly a quarter of the screen's width, about 60 pixels. On Super NES, he and his whip take up more than a third of the screen at more than 90 pixels. On top of that, Simon's flagellation skills have gotten a serious upgrade for Super NES. He's no longer limited to striking straight ahead. He can now whip up into the air, attack downward while leaping, and strike at all 4 diagonals on top of that. This was effectively impossible on NES, since you activated sub-weapons with up plus attack. However, the Super NES's expanded button array allows you to put sub-weapons on their own separate button. Not that you really need to use sub-weapons all that often now. The thing about tools like the axe and dagger was that they allowed 8-bit Simon to hit enemies who hovered outside of the whip's default and very limited range. Now, the whip's range covers a huge percentage of the play area. Stand in the middle of the screen, and there's not a whole lot of space you can't just hit with your whip. Sub-weapons become far less essential when your free basic attack has become so versatile. They're great in specific situations, especially for battling certain bosses, but generally you can take them or leave them. And the whip has even more functions than that. Now players can continue depressing the action button after a strike to hold his whip limp ahead of him and wiggle it around. A hanging whip has very little attack power, but it allows you to block projectiles. You can also dangle the whip to inflict light, repeated damage against foes like Dragon Skull cannons. On top of that, you can also use the whip to latch onto grapple points and swing from platform to platform. Bionic Commando this ain't, but swinging opens up a few alternate paths through stages and allows you to snag otherwise unreachable power-ups. Still, this feels like the most poorly considered aspect of Super Castlevania IV. The game retains conventions of the 8-bit games, ranging from the same mix of sub-weapons, to attack multipliers, to quick whip upgrades. But you have to wonder why. They feel perfunctory, as if they were included because that's how Castlevania has to work, rather than because they complement the gameplay that actually exists here. There's unfortunately a bit of a half-baked feeling about Super Castlevania IV, with most challenge arising from instant death traps, rather than from interesting enemy arrangements. A far cry from the series' best outings on NES. I hate to sound overly negative here because there is a lot to love about Super Castlevania IV. Yes, the unfortunate interplay between character proportions and whip-based combat almost completely break the workings of the game, but everything is so richly realized that you can honestly just enjoy the game as kind of a content tourist. Simon's journey to Dracula's Tower is packed with memorable moments and set pieces crammed with detail. You begin the adventure by traveling through the perimeter of the castle grounds, working your way through the haunted stables, a forest, clockwork traps, a library, and the depths of a dungeon. Some of the scenarios, again, appear to have been plucked straight from previous adventures. The flooded ruins of Stage 3 come straight from Castlevania III, all the way down to the twin vipers you have to fight at the end. Birds dropping hopping monsters return, though this time eagles become harpies, bombarding you with the gremlins that replaced Fleamen in Castlevania III. Likewise, the forest with its descending spiders that barf out tinier spiders at you, the muddy limestone caverns, and the catacombs. You'll fight lots of familiar bosses too, including reprised versions of all of the main foes from the original Castlevania. A Medusa, a mummy, Frankenstein's monster, a glittering jewel-encrusted giant bat, and of course, Death himself. At the same time, Super Castlevania IV isn't afraid to mix things up and set its road to Dracula's Tower along unfamiliar territory too. There's a clock tower, yes, but it's small, and it focuses more heavily on the showdown with a warping mummy along the frozen hands of the tower's exterior. There's a mad chase up a tower that sees Simon fleeing desperately from a rebounding gear. And of course, there's that gimmick level. It may indeed be a string of gimmicks, but there's no denying that they're incredibly cool gimmicks. One room rotates slowly, forcing Simon to latch onto a grapple point lest he plunged into a spike-lined wall that suddenly has become a spike-lined floor. There's a race to escape a crumbling floor in a room whose walls spin in the background. It's an effect that has no impact on the game design, it just makes you anxious and more likely to slip up. Super Castlevania IV's designers weren't afraid to play with structure and silence either. You face a couple of bosses midway through a stage rather than at the end, and every once in a while you come to an area where monsters don't attack. The overall effect of these unexpected twists and structure creates a sense of unease as you journey through the castle. It's a less predictable setting than in previous games, far more varied in design and format than other Castlevania games to date. Despite its flaws, Super Castlevania IV makes for an interesting and incredibly playable side excursion into the franchise. That said, its flaws were pronounced enough that Konami never followed up on this line of evolution. Despite their clearly positioning this as the next phase of Castlevania, the company quickly backpedaled. Indeed, despite the ubiquity of Castlevania on NES, the Super NES wouldn't get another Castlevania entry until 1995, and even then that was just a watered-down version of a PC Engine game. Nope, the next two original games in the series, Bloodlines for Genesis and Rondo of Blood for PC Engine, did a much better job of recapturing the NES spirit than Super Castlevania IV. Rondo of Blood in particular is the high watermark of Classicvania and arguably of the series. While Bloodlines was largely dismissed as regressive at the time, it's held up beautifully and aged with grace. Meanwhile, Konami would take a mulligan on this attempt to remake the original Castlevania with 1993's entry for the X68000 home computer. Like Super Castlevania IV, the X68000 game was simply called Akumajo Dracula in Japan. same as the original NES game. Unlike this oddball effort, though, it takes a very traditional approach to the Castlevania formula and poses a very traditional, which is to say extreme, challenge. It comes off feeling far more like a proper remake and expansion of the NES game, with no shortage of brilliant ideas of its own in a less offbeat context. So where then does that leave Super Castlevania IV in the Castlevania legacy? Ultimately, it's an experimental effort, brimming with creativity, if a bit deficient on restraint. Between its memorable set pieces, unique mechanics, and stunning soundtrack, it definitely deserves a place in the Castlevania pantheon. But at the same time, you can't help but be glad that the series went back to the old-fashioned approach for a while, at least until reinventing itself with Symphony of the Night in 1997. It's hard to fault Konami for trying new things on new hardware, and trying to find Castlevania-appropriate uses for tech features like alpha transparencies and background deformation. Lots of developers got drunk on the dazzling built-in extras of the Super NES, but very few of the resulting works were quite as wonderful as Super Castlevania IV. Next time, we jump from Halloween to Christmas as Kevin McAllister gets left home alone.